In today's story, we follow James Delaney, a top real estate agent who has it all until his hidden prejudices are challenged. When David and Rachel Smith, a successful black couple, make an offer on a luxurious home, James secretly sabotages their bid. But the Smiths won't be dismissed so easily, and they're prepared to fight back with powerful allies. Will James be forced to face the consequences of his actions, or will he find a way to escape accountability? What happens when his perfect world starts to unravel? Find out by watching the full story, and don't forget to subscribe for more impactful narratives. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Scan people truly change. Let's dive in. James Delaney sat back in his leather office chair, surveying his kingdom from behind the sleek mahogany desk. Outside the wide, pristine windows, the wealthy suburb stretched out in all its glory, rows of stately homes with perfectly manicured lawns, the kind of neighborhood that promised success, stability, and exclusivity. His office reflected his career: expensive, tasteful, and designed to impress. Behind him, certificates, framed newspaper articles, and accolades from the real estate industry covered the wall, each one representing another deal closed, another commission earned. Over the past 2 decades, James had become the top real estate agent for the city's wealthiest, brokering deals worth millions. His clients trusted him implicitly because he understood the lifestyle they wanted to protect. The phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. Linda, his assistant, peeked in through the doorway, her tablet in hand. "James, here's your schedule for the day." James took the tablet, scrolling through the list of appointments. Another busy day, as always. He prided himself on staying active, constantly networking, keeping his name at the top of his game. People didn't come to James Delaney because they wanted a house. They came to him because they wanted an experience, one where everything was handled discreetly, professionally, and with a touch of luxury. Today's list was promising. Mr. Holloway, a tech executive looking for a summer home. Mrs. Preston, a socialite expanding her real estate portfolio. And Paul Bryant, a hedge fund manager exploring a multi-million-dollar estate outside the city. All potential commissions that would bring in the kind of money James thrived on. But as he scrolled further, a new appointment caught his eye. His thumb hesitated over the screen. The names David and Rachel Smith. Young, newly successful, new to the city. On paper, they were a dream. David was a rising star in the tech world, and Rachel was a well-known attorney who had made headlines for winning a landmark civil rights case. They had reached out to inquire about one of James' most exclusive listings, a sprawling, 10,000-square-foot estate in the Glenview neighborhood. It was one of the most expensive properties in his portfolio, a place where even the driveways were lined with imported marble. It was exactly the kind of home James specialized in selling: prestigious, luxurious, and reserved for a particular kind of client. But as James read the names again, a feeling of discomfort settled in his chest. David and Rachel Smith were black. James had never openly expressed his biases, never said the words aloud that circled in his mind. He considered himself a professional, someone who knew how to handle different clients with different needs. But deep down, James believed that certain neighborhoods, certain homes, were meant for certain people. He cleared his throat, putting down the tablet. "Schedule the showing," he told Linda, though his tone was less enthusiastic than usual. "He'll take care of it." Linda, oblivious to James's inner conflict, nodded and left the room, her heels clicking against the marble floors. James leaned back in his chair again, staring out the window. He couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. The Smiths didn't fit the image he had carefully curated for Glenview. The neighborhood was an enclave of wealth and privilege, yes, but it was also an unspoken bastion of exclusivity, a place where families had lived for generations, where their skin color matched their bank accounts. Of course, James would never say that out loud. That wasn't how things worked anymore. But that didn't mean he had to like it. He had his ways of handling situations like this, ways of making sure the right kind of buyers ended up with the properties that mattered. He would show the house as expected, and he would find subtle ways to discourage the Smiths, to make sure they realized they didn't quite belong. It was business, James told himself. Just business. Across town, David Smith stood on the balcony of their temporary apartment, looking out at the skyline. Moving to this new city had been an adventure, one filled with excitement and ambition. His tech startup was gaining traction faster than he had ever imagined, and Rachel's career had taken off as well. This was their moment to build something permanent, a home where they could raise a family and grow their lives together. David took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. The apartment they were renting was nice enough, but it wasn't home. It was temporary, and they were ready for more. Today was the day they would see the Glenview estate, the house they had both fallen in love with the moment they saw the photos online. Rachel stepped out onto the balcony, joining David. She smiled as she leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Nervous?" she asked. David chuckled, though there was a touch of nervous energy in his voice. "A little. I guess it's just, I don't want to get my hopes up, you know? What if it's not what we think it is?" Rachel squeezed his arm. "It'll be perfect. And if it's not, we'll find something else. But this house, David, I don't know, it feels like the right one." She was right. There was something about the estate that had spoken to both of them. The photos showed high ceilings, vast windows, a kitchen that would make any chef jealous, and a backyard large enough for the children they planned to have one day. It was everything they had ever wanted. But there was a small part of David that couldn't ignore the lingering doubt. They had faced challenges before, subtle, unspoken barriers. The kind of challenges where people didn't outright say no, but made you feel like you didn't belong. Had experienced it in the tech world, and Rachel had faced it in the courtroom. Even with all their success, they knew they had to push a little harder, fight a little longer to get what others might take for granted. But they had earned this. They were ready. James stood at the entrance of the Glenview estate, glancing down at his watch. The Smiths were due to arrive any minute, and he was already rehearsing his pitch. Not the standard sales pitch, the one designed to make them second-guess their decision. He had already reviewed the details of the house. He knew the subtle flaws that he could point out, the tiny imperfections that might make the house seem less appealing. He had done this before, with other clients who didn't quite fit the profile he had in mind for certain homes. It wasn't about overtly denying them the property, it was about nudging them in a different direction, making them feel like there were better options elsewhere. The sound of a car pulling up the long tree-lined driveway pulled James out of his thoughts. A sleek black SUV came to a stop and the doors opened. David and Rachel Smith stepped out, and for a brief moment, James' professional facade slipped. They were exactly the kind of couple he had expected, successful, stylish, and confident. But they weren't the kind of couple he had in mind for Glenview. James forced a smile as he walked over to greet them. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith, welcome. I'm James Delaney. It's a pleasure to meet you both." David extended his hand, his smile genuine. "Likewise, Mr. Delaney. We've heard a lot about you. Thanks for showing us the house today." "Of course," James replied, shaking David's hand. Rachel followed, her handshake firm but warm. "Let's get started, shall we?" As they walked through the front doors, the Smiths' reactions were immediate. Rachel's eyes widened as she took in the grand foyer, the sweeping staircase, and the light that poured in from the massive windows. "This is beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. David nodded, equally impressed. "It's even better than the pictures." James led them through the house, pointing out the various features, the imported marble floors, the custom woodwork, the state-of-the-art appliances. But as they moved from room to room, he began slipping in his subtle discouragements. "The kitchen is gorgeous, of course," James said as they entered the expansive space, "but some of the appliances are a little dated. You might want to replace them if you're looking for something more modern." David glanced at the stainless steel refrigerator and range, then shrugged. "We can always upgrade later. The space itself is what we really love." James smiled, though internally he felt a flicker of frustration. That hadn't worked. They moved into the living room, where James pointed out a small crack in one of the windows. "It's nothing serious, of course, but it's something to be aware of. Fixing these older windows can get expensive." Rachel nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "Well, have someone take a look, but I don't think it's a deal-breaker." As the tour continued, James realized that none of his usual tactics were working. The Smiths weren't easily deterred. They asked thoughtful questions about the neighborhood, the schools, the amenities. They seemed genuinely interested in making this their home, despite James's attempts to nudge them away. Finally, as they reached the backyard, an enormous space with manicured gardens and a sparkling pool, Rachel turned to David, her eyes gleaming. "This is it," she said softly. "This is the one." David smiled, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, I think you're right." James' heart sank. He had been hoping they wouldn't reach this conclusion, that they would find something, anything, to make them hesitate. But they were ready. They wanted the house. "Well," James said, clearing his throat, "I'll speak with the sellers, and we can go from there. But just to be upfront, this is a very competitive property. We've had a lot of interest, and the asking price is quite high. It's not for everyone." David, undeterred, smiled confidently. "We're ready to make a full-price offer. We'll have our financing in place by the end of the week." James blinked, caught off guard by their decisiveness. "That's great. I'll reach out to the sellers and keep you updated." The Smiths thanked him and left, their excitement palpable. But as James watched them drive away, his mind was already racing with ways to derail their offer. There were always ways to delay, ways to shift things in the direction he wanted. He had done it before, and he could do it again. In the days that followed, David and Rachel eagerly awaited news from James. They had put everything in motion, working with their lender to finalize the financing, preparing their offer, and lining up all the necessary paperwork. Everything was ready, but James was silent. At first, they assumed it was just part of the process. Real estate deals could be slow, especially with a property as exclusive as the Glenview estate. But as the days turned into a week, Rachel began to grow impatient. "Have you heard anything?" she asked one evening, sitting across from David at the dining table, her laptop open in front of her. David shook his head, frowning as he scrolled through his phone. "Nope, not a word. I've called a couple of times, but I keep getting his assistant. She says he's in meetings." Rachel's jaw clenched. Something doesn't feel right. David nodded in agreement. He had been thinking the same thing. This wasn't how the process was supposed to work. They had made a strong offerful asking price, no contingencies, and yet they hadn't received any response. Rachel closed her laptop, her expression serious. "We need to push harder. We've come too far to let this slip away." David agreed. "I'll make a few more calls tomorrow. We're not giving up on this." It wasn't until a few days later that they finally heard from James. But the news wasn't what they expected. David was in the middle of a meeting at his office when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Seeing James' name on the screen, he quickly excused himself and stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Mr. Delaney," David said, his voice eager. "Thanks for getting back to me. What's the latest on the Glenview property?" James' voice was distant, cold. "I'm afraid I have some bad news. The sellers have decided to go in a different direction." David felt his heart drop. "What do you mean we offered full asking price?" "I understand," James replied, his tone flat. "But they've chosen another buyer." David was silent for a moment, trying to process the information. This didn't make sense. They had done everything right, but we were prepared to close the deal. What more could they want? "I'm sorry, Mr. Smith," James said, his voice lacking any real empathy. "It's out of my hands now." But David knew that wasn't true. James had never intended to present their offer. He had sabotaged them from the beginning, using his influence to make sure they never had a fair shot at the property. David hung up the phone, his hand trembling with anger. When he told Rachel what had happened, her face went pale. "They can't do that," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "That's not right." "No," David replied, his jaw clenched. "It's not. But we're not giving up. I think it's time we call Michael." David Smith sat at his desk, fuming as he stared at the phone in his hand. James Delaney's words played over and over in his mind. The sellers have decided to go in a different direction. It didn't make any sense. They had offered the full asking price, and he knew their offer was competitive. Something wasn't right. He turned to look at Rachel, who sat on the couch in their living room, furiously typing on her laptop. She had been researching housing discrimination cases all morning, trying to find any legal recourse they could take. As a lawyer, Rachel was used to fighting for justice, but this felt personal. She had dealt with enough subtle discrimination throughout her career, and she recognized it now for what it was. "They didn't even give us a chance, David," Rachel said, her voice tinged with frustration. "This is exactly what I feared. They've probably chosen someone they feel is a better fit for the neighborhood." David clenched his fists, his frustration growing. "I know, and that's why we're not letting this go. We've fought too hard to get where we are. I'm calling Michael." Rachel nodded. She knew that bringing in Michael Brooks was their best chance at getting the attention they deserved. Michael was a close friend of theirs and a highly respected businessman with deep connections in the city. More importantly, he had the clout to hold people accountable. If anyone could get to the bottom of this situation, it was him. David dialed Michael's number, feeling a knot of tension in his stomach as he waited for his friend to pick up. After a few rings, Michael's deep, confident voice came through the line. "David, how's it going, man?" Michael asked, his tone friendly and upbeat. David wasted no time getting to the point. "Michael, I hate to bring this to you, but we've got a problem. We made an offer on a property full asking price, everything lined up, and the realtor, James Delaney, basically shut us down. He's telling us the sellers went with someone else, but I have a feeling there's more to it than that." There was a pause on the other end of the line as Michael processed what David was saying. "Hold on, they shut down a full-price offer without even considering it. That doesn't make any sense." David sighed. "That's exactly what I'm saying. We've done everything right, but I think there's something else going on here." Rachel, overhearing the conversation, chimed in. "Michael, I've dealt with people like Delaney before. He's got a reputation for selling to a very specific kind of buyer. I think we're being pushed aside because we don't fit into the neighborhood." Michael's tone grew serious. "You think this is about more than just business, huh?" "We know it is," David said, his voice firm. "I need your help, Michael. You have the kind of connections that can get through to these people. If we just let this slide, it sets a dangerous precedent." Michael was silent for a moment, and David could almost hear the gears turning in his friend's mind. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice resolute. "All right, I'm in. Let me make a few calls. If this is what you think it is, I'll make sure Delaney can't just sweep this under the rug. We're going to get you that house, David, one way or another." David let out a sigh of relief. "Thanks, Michael. I knew we could count on you." "Don't thank me yet," Michael replied. "We've got a fight ahead of us." James Delaney was back in his office, feeling a sense of relief that the Smiths' offer had been quietly dismissed. He had managed to steer the situation just as he'd planned, deflecting, delaying, and ultimately pushing the Smiths aside for a more appropriate buyer. In his mind, it was all part of maintaining the integrity of the neighborhoods he worked so hard to protect. But as he scanned his email, his relief was short-lived. A new inquiry had come in from Michael Brooks. The name immediately caught James' attention. Michael was a high-profile businessman, known for his philanthropic work and connections throughout the city. He wasn't just another buyer, he was someone who could significantly boost James' reputation if handled correctly. James read the message carefully. Michael was interested in seeing the Glenview estate, the very property he had just dismissed the Smiths from. Michael didn't mention anything about knowing the Smiths, and James assumed this would be a straightforward showing. A high-profile client like Michael Brooks was the kind of deal that could erase any minor hiccup from the past. James quickly typed a response, eager to set up a private showing. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for your interest in the Glenview estate. I'd be happy to arrange a private viewing for you at your earliest convenience. Please let me know what time works best for you, and I will ensure everything is ready. James Delaney." Within minutes, Michael replied, suggesting a viewing for the next day. James confirmed the appointment and leaned back in his chair, already imagining the success of closing such a high-profile deal. What James didn't know was that Michael Brooks wasn't interested in buying the house for himself. He was coming to expose the discrimination his friends had faced, and he wasn't coming alone. The following day, James arrived at the Glenview estate an hour before the scheduled showing. As usual, he meticulously prepared the house, adjusting the lighting, straightening the throw pillows, and ensuring that every detail was perfect. He knew that first impressions were everything, and for a client like Michael Brooks, everything had to be flawless. James checked his watch. Michael was due to arrive any minute. He glanced out the window and saw a sleek black car pull up to the driveway. Straightening his tie, James took a deep breath and stepped outside to greet his potential client. As Michael Brooks stepped out of the car, James immediately recognized the powerful presence he exuded. Tall, well-dressed, and with a confident stride, Michael Brooks was the kind of client any realtor would be eager to impress. "Mr. Brooks, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," James said, extending his hand with a practiced smile. Michael shook his hand, but there was something in his eyes that caught James off guard, a coolness, a sharpness that made James feel slightly uneasy. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Delaney," Michael replied, his tone polite but firm. "I've heard a lot about you." Before James could respond, the back door of the car opened, and two familiar figures stepped out, David and Rachel Smith. James' heart skipped a beat, and for a moment his professional demeanor cracked. He hadn't expected to see them again, certainly not with Michael Brooks. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. Michael turned to David and Rachel, a knowing smile on his face. "David, Rachel, I believe you're familiar with Mr. Delaney." David nodded, his expression unreadable. "Oh, we've met." James swallowed hard, his smile faltering. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith? I wasn't expecting you." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "No, I suppose you weren't." Michael's tone was steady as he turned back to James. "You see, Mr. Delaney, David, and Rachel are good friends of mine, and they've told me quite a bit about their experience trying to purchase this property." James felt his palms begin to sweat. This wasn't the usual real estate negotiation. This was something far more dangerous. He had worked hard to avoid situations like this, to keep everything under the surface, but now it was coming to light, and there was no easy way out. Michael continued, his gaze piercing. "From what I understand, they made a full-price offer, and you didn't even present it to the sellers." James forced a nervous laugh, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm sure there was some sort of misunderstanding. I've had multiple offers on the property, and I was in the process of reviewing them." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Really, because we didn't hear a word from you after we made our offer, and we know for a fact that the sellers never saw it." David stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with frustration. "We're not here to argue, James. We just want the truth." James could feel the weight of their gazes on him. His heart pounded as the realization set in he was trapped. There was no way to backtrack or smooth things over with the usual charm that had served him so well in the past. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, and they all knew it. "I'll need to check with the sellers again," James stammered, trying to find a way out of the confrontation. "There's been a lot of interest in the property, and sometimes things slip through the cracks." Michael crossed his arms, his expression unimpressed. "Mr. Delaney, let's be honest here. This has nothing to do with cracks in the system. This is about you deliberately pushing the Smiths out because you didn't think they belonged in this neighborhood." James' face flushed with embarrassment, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Rachel cut him off. "You didn't just ignore our offer, James," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You made sure we didn't even have a chance, and that's not something we can just let go." James glanced between them, his mind scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. He could deny it, he could try to spin the story, but it was clear that Michael wasn't someone who would fall for those tactics. And David and Rachel weren't going to let this slide quietly. Michael stepped forward, his voice lowering. "You know, James, this doesn't have to get messy. But if you don't make things right, I'll make sure the whole city knows what happened here." The threat hung in the air, and James knew it wasn't an idle one. Michael Brooks had the influence and connections to ruin him. His reputation, carefully built over years of catering to the city's elite, could crumble overnight if word got out that he had deliberately discriminated against the Smiths. "I'll fix it," James said, his voice shaky. "I'll present the offer to the sellers right away." Rachel's expression softened slightly, though the anger was still there. "You should have done that in the first place," David added. "This isn't just about us, James. It's about the way you operate. We're not the first people you've done this to, are we?" James didn't answer. He couldn't. They knew the truth. The pressure was unbearable. James retreated to his car, his hands trembling as he pulled out his phone to call the sellers Mr. and Mrs. Green. He had been avoiding this moment, hoping to quietly steer the deal in another direction. But now there was no avoiding it. He had to present the Smiths' offer. His fingers hovered over the call button for a moment before he took a deep breath and dialed the number. The phone rang twice before Mrs. Green answered, her cheerful voice filling the car. "James, how are you? We've been waiting for an update on the offers." James forced himself to sound calm, though his nerves were frayed. "I'm doing well, Mrs. Green. I've actually just received an offer I think you'll be interested in." "Oh, tell me more." James swallowed hard. "There's a full-price offer from a couple, David and Rachel Smith. They're very interested in the property." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mrs. Green spoke again, her tone surprised. "That's wonderful news. Why didn't we hear about this sooner?" James' heart sank. I was reviewing other offers, but I believe this one is the best option. I can send the details over right away." Mrs. Green's voice brightened. "Please do, we're eager to move forward with the sale. If everything checks out, I think we can proceed." James nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'll get the paperwork to you immediately." As he hung up the phone, James felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The sale was going through, but it wasn't a victory. It was a defeat, a reminder that no matter how carefully he tried to control the narrative, the truth had a way of coming out. He stepped out of the car and walked back toward the house, where Michael, David, and Rachel were waiting. The weight of their eyes on him felt heavier than ever. "The sellers have accepted your offer," James said, his voice hollow. David and Rachel exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had won, but the victory was bittersweet. The fight they had been forced to endure had taken its toll. Michael nodded, satisfied but not triumphant. "I'm glad you did the right thing, James. But don't think this is over? People like David and Rachel deserve to be treated fairly from the start, not after they've been forced to fight for it." James didn't respond. He knew Michael was right. James Delaney drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The usual feeling of accomplishment that followed closing a deal was absent. Instead, a hollow, gnawing sensation sat in the pit of his stomach. The Glenview estate was officially sold, and yet this was no victory. He had spent decades cultivating a reputation for himself as the city's premier real estate agent, a man who could deliver the best properties to the best clients. But today, that carefully constructed image had cracked. Michael Brooks, David, and Rachel Smith had seen right through him, and worse, they had forced him to confront something he had been trying to ignore for years. Deep down, he knew he wasn't just conducting business. As usual, he had let his prejudices dictate his decisions. The realization stung more than he cared to admit. He pulled into the driveway of his own home, a sprawling property nestled in a leafy upscale suburb, much like Glenview. The house was everything he had worked for, a testament to his success. But tonight, it felt like a reminder of his failures. As James stepped through the front door, his wife, Karen, greeted him with her usual warm smile. "Hey, how did the showing go?" she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Did you sell that big estate?" James hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. "Yeah," he finally said, though his voice lacked any excitement. "It's sold." Karen's smile faded slightly, sensing that something was off. "What's wrong? That's a good thing, right?" James sank into the nearest chair, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated." Karen sat beside him, her expression concerned. "What happened?" James sighed, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired that day. Slowly, he explained the situation, the Smiths, their offer, his decision to ignore it, and how Michael Brooks had called him out. He confessed how he had tried to manipulate the sale to keep the Smiths out of Glenview, and how it had all come crashing down when Michael intervened. When he finished, Karen was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "James, I love you, but this isn't right. You can't treat people like that, no matter who they are or where they come from." "I know," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I messed up, but I didn't see it that way at the time. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, keeping things the way they've always been." Karen shook her head. "The way things have always been isn't good enough anymore. You have to change." James nodded, though he wasn't sure if he knew how. For years, he had been working under the same assumption, serving a specific type of client, preserving the status quo in the most affluent areas. But now, that approach felt outdated and wrong. He had never considered the real harm it caused until now. "I don't know how to fix this," James admitted, his voice breaking slightly. Karen reached out and took his hand. "You start by owning it. You did something wrong, but that doesn't mean you can't make things right. It's going to take more than an apology, James. You need to change how you think, how you do business." James looked down at their clasped hands. Karen was right, he couldn't just brush this off or pretend it didn't matter. It wasn't just about losing a deal or damaging his reputation. This was about who he was as a person. And if he didn't do something to change, the damage would only continue. The next morning, James woke with the same feeling of dread hanging over him. His mind kept replaying the events from the day before. Michael Brooks' calm but firm confrontation, Rachel's piercing words, and David's silent, cold anger. For the first time in his career, James felt truly ashamed. He wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who had hurt people through his actions, people who had trusted him to do the right thing. Sitting at the breakfast table, James scrolled through his phone, checking emails and messages. He wasn't surprised to find that his inbox was quieter than usual. His clients had always relied on him to deliver deals quickly, efficiently, and with minimal drama. But now, word was getting out. It wasn't a scandal, not yet, but whispers had started to circulate in the real estate community. He could feel the subtle shift. Few clients had delayed meetings, others had suddenly become too busy to discuss upcoming properties. The cracks were starting to show. His phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from Michael Brooks. James hesitated before opening it. He wasn't sure if he was ready to read whatever Michael had to say, but he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. "James, I'm glad you did the right thing and presented David and Rachel's offer, but that doesn't mean this is over. This isn't just about one sale. It's about the way you've been doing business for years. If you want to avoid a bigger problem, I suggest you start making some real changes. I'm willing to talk if you are, but this is your chance to turn things around before it's too late." Michael Brooks. James sat back in his chair, the words sinking in. Michael was offering him a lifeline, but it came with a clear expectation. This wasn't just about making amends with the Smiths. It was about confronting the prejudices that had guided so many of his decisions over the years. If he didn't, Michael would make sure that the quiet whispers in the real estate world turned into something much louder. After a long pause, James typed out a reply. "Michael, thank you for your email. I know I've made some serious mistakes, and I want to make things right. I'm ready to have that conversation. Let me know when you're available to meet. James Delaney." He hit send and leaned back, exhaling slowly. This was the beginning of something new, something difficult. But he knew it was the only way forward. While James wrestled with his conscience, life for the Smiths was slowly returning to normal, though normal now carried a new weight. The Glenview estate was theirs, but the process of securing it had left them emotionally drained. Rachel sat in her new home office, scrolling through the mountain of legal documents that had been finalized just days before. She should have felt victorious, satisfied even, but instead, there was an undercurrent of exhaustion that she couldn't shake. This wasn't how buying a home was supposed to feel. It wasn't supposed to feel like a battle won through sheer determination. David, meanwhile, stood at the kitchen island fixing a cup of coffee. His thoughts mirrored Rachel's. Yes, they had the house, but what had it cost them? He couldn't help but think about the countless others who didn't have the resources or connections they did. People who might have given up after the first few roadblocks, or who never even got their foot in the door in the first place. Rachel's voice broke the silence. "Do you think we'll ever stop feeling like we have to fight for everything?" she asked, not looking up from her laptop. David walked over, placing the coffee in front of her. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought we'd be past this by now, but it seems like every step forward comes with another challenge." Rachel sighed, her fingers rubbing her temples. "I'm tired, David. Tired of always having to prove ourselves, of having to fight just to be treated fairly." David nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He knew she was right. They had fought so hard to get where they were, and yet there were still battles left to fight. But they weren't the kind of people to back down, even when the odds were stacked against them. "We have to keep going," David said quietly. "Not just for us, but for everyone else who's dealing with the same thing. We have the resources, the platform. We can do something about this." Rachel looked up at him, her expression softening. "You're right," she said, her voice resolute. "We can't let this be the end. We need to help others who don't have the same support." David took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll do it together. We've always been stronger that way." Together, they began to plan their next steps, not just in their personal lives, but in their fight for housing equality. They would use their experience to bring attention to the issues that people of color faced in the housing market, advocating for change through both Rachel's legal expertise and David's growing influence in the tech world. Their story wasn't just about buying a home anymore. It was about creating a future where others wouldn't have to go through the same struggles. A few days later, James found himself sitting across from Michael Brooks at a small cafe on the edge of the city. It was a far cry from the luxurious settings James was used to, but somehow it felt right. This wasn't about luxury or business deals, it was about facing the consequences of his actions and making a change. Michael studied James for a moment before speaking. "I appreciate you reaching out," he said, "but I need to know, are you really ready to change, or are you just trying to protect your reputation?" James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Honestly, it's both," he admitted. "I know my reputation is at risk, but I also know that I've been wrong. I've let my biases affect how I do business, and it's hurt people. I don't want to be that person anymore." Michael nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "You need to understand, James, this isn't just about one deal. You've been doing this for years. The way you've treated people, it's not something you can fix overnight." "I know," James said quietly, "but I want to start." Michael leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "All right, if you're serious about this, here's what I suggest. You need to take a hard look at how you've been running your business. You need to stop catering only to a specific kind of client and start serving everyone equally. And you need to get involved in the community, help support families who don't have the same resources as your wealthy clients." James nodded. "I'll do it. I'll make the changes." Michael wasn't convinced yet. "It's going to take more than words, James. People like David and Rachel and others who've been shut out need to see that you're actually committed to doing better. You need to take real action." James understood. Words wouldn't be enough. He needed to prove that he was ready to make a difference. "I'm willing to do the work," he said, his voice steady. "I'll make sure it happens." Michael studied him for a moment longer before finally nodding. "All right, let's see what you do." In the weeks that followed, James threw himself into the task of rebuilding his business from the ground up. He began attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, learning about the unconscious biases that had influenced his decisions for so long. He partnered with local housing organizations that focused on helping minority families find homes in neighborhoods where they had historically been excluded. He also took a hard look at his client base. For years, he had exclusively catered to the wealthy elite, ignoring those who didn't fit the mold. But now, he was determined to serve a broader range of clients. He started offering his services to families from all backgrounds, working to connect them with homes in neighborhoods that had once been out of reach. It wasn't easy. There were days when James felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was trying to change. But he knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was progress. Meanwhile, David and Rachel continued their work as advocates for housing equality. They spoke at community forums, raised awareness about discriminatory practices in the real estate industry, and pushed for legislative changes that would protect future home buyers from the same struggles they had faced. Their story became an inspiration for others, a reminder that change was possible even in the face of systemic barriers. And while the fight for equality was far from over, David and Rachel knew that they had made a meaningful impact. Months passed, and James slowly began to rebuild both his business and his reputation. He had lost clients, there was no denying that. Some of his wealthiest, most exclusive clients had moved on to other agents, uncomfortable with the new direction James was taking. But he didn't mind. In their place, he had gained new clients, people who had been overlooked or ignored for far too long. Families who wanted nothing more than a fair chance at owning a home. One day, as he sat in his office reviewing the details of a new sale, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Rachel Smith. "James, we wanted to thank you for the changes you've made. It hasn't gone unnoticed. We're glad to see that you're taking real steps to make things right. Keep going, it matters. Rachel and David." James stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was a start. A sign that the path he was on was the right one. For the first time in a long time, James felt hopeful. Several months after the sale of the Glenview estate, James Delaney found himself in a very different position than he had ever imagined. His business was no longer the exclusive, luxury-focused real estate powerhouse it had once been. Instead, it had become a place where families of all backgrounds came for guidance and assistance. His reputation among the ultra-elite had taken a hit, but his business was growing in a new and meaningful way. His clientele had become more diverse, with many new clients appreciating the change in his approach and his commitment to fairness. James had shifted his focus toward affordable housing and equal access initiatives, using his skills to help people who had been marginalized in the market. It was a long road, but he was starting to see the results. He had begun offering workshops for first-time homebuyers, particularly in communities of color, to help families understand the home buying process and avoid the traps of predatory lending. One afternoon, as James was reviewing files at his desk, his assistant Linda walked in, a bit hesitant. "James, there's someone here to see you. You might want to take this one in private," she said, her voice low. James raised an eyebrow, curious but not alarmed. He had faced his share of difficult conversations in recent months, and had learned to handle them. "Who is it?" he asked. "It's David Smith," she said. James' heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen David or Rachel since the sale closed, though he had exchanged emails with them. He had been expecting this moment for a long time, wondering if it would ever come. Now here it was. "Send him in," James said, steeling himself for whatever the conversation might bring. David entered the room a moment later, his tall frame and calm demeanor filling the space. He looked around briefly before meeting James' eyes. There was no animosity in his gaze, just a quiet, almost cautious resolve. "David, it's good to see you," James said, standing to shake his hand. He felt the tension in the air, but was determined to meet the moment with sincerity. "Good to see you too, James," David replied, shaking his hand firmly but with no animosity. He took a seat across from James, leaning back slightly as if measuring his words carefully. For a moment, there was silence. James knew that David wasn't the type to mince words or offer meaningless pleasantries, and he respected that. He decided to speak first. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I want you to know that it's changed the way I look at everything. My business, my decisions, all of it. I know I didn't just hurt you and Rachel. I damaged a lot of trust, and I'm working hard to rebuild that." David nodded slowly. "I've seen the changes you've made. Rachel and I have talked about it a lot, and we're glad you're taking steps to do better. But I didn't come here to talk about the past. I came to talk about the future." James blinked in surprise. "The future?" David smiled faintly, though there was still a seriousness in his expression. "Yeah, you've started to make a difference, and that's important. But there's a lot more work to be done. I came here because I think we can help each other." James was intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "We've been working with a few organizations that focus on housing equality and economic justice," David explained. "These are groups that work to help families who've been pushed out of neighborhoods or denied the same opportunities as others. They need someone with your expertise to help navigate the system and open doors that have been closed for too long." James leaned forward, listening intently. This was exactly the kind of work he had wanted to get involved in ever since his conversation with Michael Brooks. "I'd be honored to help in any way I can," James said. "I've already been trying to shift my focus toward helping underrepresented families, but there's still so much I don't know. Working with people like you and Rachel would make a real impact." David nodded, seeming to appreciate James's willingness to learn. "That's what I'm hoping for. It's not just about selling houses, James. It's about making sure people have access to opportunities that were denied to them for generations." James felt a swell of gratitude for this opportunity to work alongside people who had every right to distance themselves from him, but were instead offering him a path forward. "I'm all in," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever you need, I'm ready." For the first time in what felt like years, James felt like he was on the right path where his work wasn't just about commissions or prestige, but about creating real change. While James was navigating his new role in the real estate world, David and Rachel Smith had been making their own strides toward promoting housing equality. Rachel's legal work had expanded beyond her law firm, as she began taking on more pro bono cases focused on fighting housing discrimination. Her expertise in civil rights law gave her the tools to take on the subtler forms of discrimination that often went unchallenged in court. One evening, Rachel sat at her home office desk, reviewing a case involving a family who had been denied a mortgage based on vague and arbitrary criteria. She was building a strong argument, one that could potentially set a new precedent in the fight for equal housing rights. David entered the room quietly, carrying a cup of tea for her. "How's it going?" David asked, setting the cup down on the desk. Rachel smiled gratefully, rubbing her eyes as she glanced at the clock. "Good. It's just this is one case, one family out of so many. Sometimes it feels overwhelming." David nodded, understanding her frustration. "I know. But you're making a difference, Rach. You're helping families who wouldn't have had a chance otherwise." Rachel sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It just feels like the system is so stacked against them. Even when we win one case, there's another family going through the same thing." David sat down next to her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "That's why we have to keep pushing. This is bigger than just us or our house. We're fighting for something that affects generations of people." Rachel nodded, her resolve returning. "You're right, and I'm not giving up." In addition to her legal work, Rachel had begun organizing community forums, bringing together families who had experienced discrimination in the housing market. She wanted to create a space where people could share their stories and build a network of support. These forums became a place for people to strategize, to fight back against the barriers they faced, and to demand change. David, on the other hand, had used his influence in the tech world to push for more diversity and inclusion in corporate housing policies. He began speaking at conferences and tech summits about the importance of fair housing practices, encouraging other business leaders to support affordable housing initiatives. His company started a new grant program that provided financial assistance to underrepresented families looking to buy homes in higher-income neighborhoods, helping them overcome some of the financial barriers that had kept them out for so long. Together, David and Rachel were building a legacy not just for their family, but for countless others who would follow in their footsteps. Their new home wasn't just a symbol of their success, it was a reminder of the fight for justice that still needed to be won. As the months passed, James Delaney's involvement in housing equality deepened. He worked closely with the organizations David had connected him with, offering his expertise to families who were navigating the complex real estate market. He also began attending more public forums and discussions on housing rights, learning from people whose experiences were vastly different from his own. One day, as he was leading a workshop for first-time homebuyers in a low-income neighborhood, James was struck by the sheer number of people who had been pushed aside by the same system he had once thrived in. For years, he had been part of the problem, shutting out people who didn't fit the mold of what he considered acceptable buyers. But now, seeing these families who had every right to own a home, he understood just how much damage his old ways had caused. After the workshop, a young woman approached him, holding a folder filled with papers. "Mr. Delaney, thank you so much for this session," she said, her voice nervous but grateful. "I've been trying to buy a house for months, but every time I apply for a mortgage, something goes wrong. I didn't realize how much of the process I didn't understand until today." James smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "I'm glad I could help. Buying a home is a big step, and it can be overwhelming, but don't give up. You deserve this." As the woman walked away, James felt a surge of pride. This was what his work should have been about all along, helping people achieve their dreams, not standing in their way. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could build a better future. Months turned into a year, and the world around James, David, and Rachel continued to change. Their efforts, along with those of countless others, had begun to make a real impact on the community. Housing discrimination cases were being fought in court, and new policies were being implemented to ensure that all families had access to the housing market, regardless of race or background. James' business had transformed into something entirely new. He wasn't the top real estate agent for the city's wealthy elite anymore, but that didn't bother him. He was doing work that mattered, work that made a difference in people's lives. He had become a trusted advisor for families who had been overlooked for far too long, and he had built a reputation for fairness, integrity, and inclusion. As for David and Rachel, their advocacy continued to grow. They had become leaders in the fight for housing equality, using their voices and their platforms to demand change at both the local and national levels. Their journey had started with a dream of buying a home, but it had turned into something far greater, a movement for justice, fairness, and equal opportunity. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, David and Rachel stood on the back porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. The house that had once been a symbol of their struggle was now a place of peace, a place where they could build the future they had always dreamed of. Rachel leaned her head on David's shoulder, her voice soft but filled with determination. "We've come so far." David nodded, his heart full. "And we've still got a long way to go." Rachel smiled. "But we're ready." Together, they walked toward their children, hand in hand, ready to continue the fight for a better future, not just for themselves, but for everyone. As time passed, the seeds of change that David, Rachel, and James had planted began to bear fruit. New housing policies were enacted, making it easier for minority families to break into neighborhoods that had once been off-limits. Real estate agents across the city began reevaluating their practices, inspired by the transformation they saw in James' business. And families who had once been denied the chance to own a home were finally getting the keys to their future. James Delaney had become a different man who was proud of the work he was doing, not because it brought him wealth or prestige, but because it made the world a little more just. David and Rachel continued their fight, knowing that there was still much to be done, but also knowing that they had made a difference. Their story had inspired others, showing that with determination, courage, and the support of a community, real change was possible. In the end, the fight for housing equality wasn't just about houses or neighborhoods, it was about people. People who deserved a chance to build a life for themselves and their families, regardless of where they came from or the color of their skin. And as the years passed, David, Rachel, and James knew that their work would continue, leaving behind a legacy of hope, justice, and opportunity for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story of redemption, justice, and the fight for equality, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon, so you never miss an upload, and stay tuned for more compelling narratives that shine a light on important social issues. Let's keep the conversation going and work together toward positive change. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and comment below with your thoughts. I was wondering when you'd come to your senses. I assume you've changed your mind about my offer. Ethan shook his head, his resolve firm. I'm not here to accept your offer, Greg. I'm here to tell you I'm done with all of this. Hawthorne raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Done? What are you talking about? I'm done with the cutthroat games, the power plays, all of it, Ethan said calmly. I've spent too long hurting people, and I'm not going to be that man anymore. Hawthorne scoffed. Come on, Ethan. Don't tell me you've gone soft. Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. I've changed, Greg. And if you can't respect that, Then we have nothing more to talk about." Hawthorne stared at him for a long moment, clearly taken aback by Ethan's newfound conviction. Finally, he shrugged. "Your loss, Carter. But don't expect anyone else to play nice in this world." Ethan smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. "I'm not looking for nice, Greg. I'm looking for something real." With that, Ethan stood and walked out of the restaurant, leaving his old life and his old self behind. As the months passed, Ethan and Olivia's relationship continued to flourish. They had built something strong, something real, and for the first time they both felt like they could see a future together. They had weathered the storm of their past and were ready to face whatever came next. But then, something unexpected happened, something that would change everything. One morning, Olivia woke up feeling nauseous, a sensation she hadn't experienced before. At first, she thought it was just stress or fatigue. But when the symptoms persisted for days, she decided to go to the doctor. The news she received was shocking. She was pregnant. Olivia sat in stunned silence as the doctor explained the results. She had never expected this, especially not now, in the midst of everything she and Ethan were going through. How could she bring a child into this world, knowing the history she and Ethan shared? And how would Ethan react to the news? That evening, as she returned to the penthouse, Olivia struggled with how to tell Ethan. She wasn't sure how he would take it, whether he would be excited, terrified, or somewhere in between. But she knew she had to tell him. She found him in the living room reading a book, his expression peaceful. For a moment she stood there watching him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ethan," Olivia said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He looked up, immediately sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong?" Olivia took a deep breath, her hands trembling. I went to the doctor today." Ethan's brow furrowed in concern. "Are you okay?" "What did they say?" "I'm pregnant?" Olivia blurted out, the words escaping her before she could stop them. For a moment Ethan was silent, his eyes wide with shock. Olivia braced herself for his reaction, unsure of what to expect. But then, to her surprise, Ethan's face broke into a wide, joyful smile. You're pregnant." Olivia nodded, her heart racing. "Yes." Without warning, Ethan pulled her into his arms, laughing and holding her close. "That's amazing, Olivia." "I can't believe it." Olivia blinked, surprised by his reaction. "You're happy." "Of course I'm happy," Ethan said, pulling back to look at her. "This is incredible. I know it's unexpected, but I'm ready for this. I'm ready to be a father." Olivia felt a wave of relief wash over her, the tension in her chest easing. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the joy of the moment, the joy of knowing that she and Ethan were going to start a family together. As the reality of their future together began to sink in, Ethan knew there was one more thing he needed to do. He had fallen in love with Olivia not just because of the circumstances that had brought them together, but because of the person she was. Strong, independent, and unyielding in her values, she had made him want to be a better man. One evening, after a quiet dinner at home, Ethan led Olivia out onto the balcony, where the lights of the city sparkled below. It was the same balcony where they had shared so many important conversations, where their relationship had started to change. "Olivia," Ethan began, his heart racing, "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through, about how we started, where we are now, and where we're going." Olivia smiled softly, her eyes filled with warmth. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Ethan nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "We have, and I don't want to lose what we've built. I want to spend the rest of my life with you not because of a bet or an agreement, but because I love you." Olivia's breath caught in her throat as Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring, its brilliance shining in the soft light. "I know this is unexpected," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I love you, Olivia. I love the life we're building together, and I want to make it official. Will you marry me this time for real?" Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as she looked at the man in front of her, the man who had once been her enemy, but who had since become the love of her life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his heart swelling with joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the lights of the city sparkled around them. This time their marriage wouldn't be based on a bet. It would be built on love, trust, and the promise of a future they would face together. A few months later, Ethan and Olivia stood together in front of a small group of family and friends, exchanging vows in a quiet, intimate ceremony. It was nothing like their first wedding. There were no business contracts, no hidden agendas, and no expectations of control or power. This time it was real. Olivia's mother was there, smiling proudly as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle. Ethan's family, too, had gathered to witness the moment, their support a reminder of how far he had come. As Ethan and Olivia stood before the officiant, their hands clasped together, they exchanged vows filled with love and sincerity. There was no need for grand declarations, just the quiet promise to stand by each other, no matter what the future held. "I promise to love you," Ethan said, his voice steady, "to respect you, and to be the man you deserve. For as long as we both live." Olivia smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "And I promise to love you, Ethan, to trust you, and to build a life with you, one filled with love, forgiveness, and hope." As they kissed, the small group of friends and family erupted into applause, but for Ethan and Olivia, the world around them seemed to disappear. In that moment, they were the only two people who mattered. As the months passed, Ethan and Olivia settled into their new life together, their love growing stronger with each passing day. Olivia's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and as they prepared to welcome their child into the world, they found themselves filled with a sense of peace and fulfillment. Ethan continued his efforts to make amends for his past mistakes, but now he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just trying to atone for his wrongs, he was trying to build a better future, not only for himself and Olivia, but for their growing family. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Olivia resting her head on Ethan's shoulder, she looked up at him with a contented smile. "Who would have thought," she mused softly, "that it would all start with a bet?" Ethan chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It's funny, isn't it, that something so ridiculous could lead to something so wonderful?" Olivia nodded, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "But I'm glad it did. Because now we get to build this life together. And that's all I've ever wanted." As they sat together in the quiet of their home, Ethan knew that this life, this love was the best thing he had ever won. Not through manipulation, not through power, but through genuine love, hard-earned respect, and the promise of a future filled with hope. A few months later, Ethan and Olivia welcomed their baby girl into the world. As Ethan held their newborn daughter in his arms, tears filled his eyes. He had never imagined that his life could feel this complete, this meaningful. Olivia watched him, her heart full as she saw the joy in his eyes. They had come so far through pain, anger, and betrayal, but now they were a family. A real family. As Ethan looked down at their daughter, he smiled, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. He had spent so long searching for power, for control, but now he realized that true strength came from love, from vulnerability, and from the willingness to change. "Welcome to the world, little one," Ethan whispered, his voice full of emotion. "You're going to have an amazing life." Olivia leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they looked down at their daughter together. "She's perfect," Olivia whispered, her voice filled with awe. "She is," Ethan agreed, his heart swelling with love. And as they sat together in the quiet of the hospital room, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning of a life filled with love, forgiveness, and endless possibilities. They had started with a bet, but now they had built something real, something that would last forever. What do you think? Do you believe in second chances, or is some damage too deep to repair? We'd love to hear your thoughts on Ethan and Olivia's journey in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more inspiring tales of love, redemption, and hope. Thanks for watching. And as long as he stayed true to his values, he knew he was on the right path. The night stretched on, full of promise and potential. And as Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. As Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. If you've enjoyed this story of Ethan's journey toward leadership and change, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below together. We can keep the conversation about diversity and inclusion going. I was thinking about it too, James said, his voice quiet but reflective. It feels like so much has happened. But at the same time, it's hard to believe how far we've come. Mildred nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. I never thought I'd live to see the day when this town could change like this. For so long it felt like we were stuck. But you showed us something different. You showed us that we could be better. James felt a lump form in his throat. I didn't do it alone, Mildred. It's been all of us. People like you, Rachel, Emily, Tommy even. Mildred chuckled softly. Maybe. But we all needed someone to remind us what we were capable of. That's what you did, James. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the sunset over the park. It was a quiet, reflective moment, one that reminded James of why he had stayed, why he had chosen to fight for this town. It's not over, James said, more to himself than to Mildred. There's still work to be done. There's always more to be done, Mildred replied with a knowing smile. But you've given this town something it didn't have before, hope. Meanwhile, Emily Green had been working on her biggest story yet. The pieces she had written for the local paper had caught the attention of a national magazine, and they had commissioned her to write a long-form feature about the transformation of Hollow Creek. She had spent months interviewing people, James, Tommy, Rachel, Sheriff Nate Johnson, and countless others. She poured her heart into the article, determined to capture the essence of what had happened in this small town. It wasn't just a story about racism or a fight for equality, it was about community, about resilience, about the power of one person's actions to ignite change. When the feature was published, it was an instant success. Readers from across the country were moved by the story of Hollow Creek, and Emily was flooded with messages of support. People wanted to know more. How had the town done it? How could they replicate that success in their own communities? For Emily, it was a deeply personal victory. She had grown up in Hollow Creek, and for a long time, she hadn't believed that the town could change. But now, as she read the responses to her article, she knew that anything was possible. The next spring, the first integrated class graduated from Hollow Creek High School. It was a historic moment, not just for the students, but for the entire town. The graduation ceremony was held in the town square, and the entire community showed up to celebrate. James was there, sitting in the front row with Mildred, Tommy, and Rachel, all of them beaming with pride. Lily Sanders, Mildred's granddaughter, gave the valedictory speech, speaking eloquently about the future, about unity, and about the lessons they had learned from the town's struggles. We are the generation that will carry this town forward, Lily said, her voice clear and strong, and we will do it together. Because we've learned that we are stronger when we stand as one. The crowd erupted into applause, and as the graduates tossed their caps into the air, there was a sense of triumph, of new beginnings. Hollow Creek had come so far, and now a new generation was ready to take the reins. As the town continued to grow and change, Harold Brooks made a surprising announcement. He was bringing back the name Rose's Diner. But this time, the name would reflect something different. Harold stood outside the diner, addressing a small crowd of onlookers. James, Mildred, and the rest of the diner's regulars were there, curious about the announcement. Rose's Diner was named after my mother, Harold began, his voice filled with emotion. She was a kind woman, a woman who believed in treating everyone with respect. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. We let this place become a symbol of division. Harold paused, glancing at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. But now I want to reclaim that name, Harold continued. This diner is going to stand for something new, something my mother would be proud of. It's going to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone has a seat at the table. The crowd cheered, and as the new sign for Rose's Diner was unveiled, it felt like a fitting tribute to the town's journey. As summer approached, Rachel Morales prepared to leave Hollow Creek once again, this time for good. Her work had taken her to other towns and cities, and while she had grown deeply attached to Hollow Creek, she knew it was time to move on. On her last night in town, she gathered with James, Emily, and the others at Rose's Diner for one final meal. The atmosphere was warm and nostalgic, filled with laughter and shared memories. "I'm going to miss this place," Rachel admitted as she sipped her coffee. "But I know you all are going to keep the momentum going." "Well, miss you too, Rachel," James said, smiling warmly. "But don't worry, we've got this." They spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about the town's journey, about how far they had come, and about the road that still lay ahead. When it was time to say goodbye, there were hugs, tears, and promises to keep in touch. But as Rachel drove away from Hollow Creek the next morning, she left knowing that the town was in good hands. Several months after Rachel's departure, James received a letter from her. He sat on his porch, the autumn air crisp and cool, as he read her words. "Dear James, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about Hollow Creek a lot lately, and I wanted to check in. I've been working with a community out west, and it reminds me so much of where Hollow Creek was when I first arrived. But seeing the progress we made gives me hope that change is possible, no matter where you are. I just wanted to thank you once again for everything you've done for the town and for me. You've taught me so much about patience, about perseverance, and about how change really happens. You'll never forget our time together. Take care of yourself, James, and take care of Hollow Creek. With gratitude, Rachel." James smiled as he folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket. Rachel's words were a reminder that their work was far from over, but it was also a reminder of how much they had already accomplished. Over time, Tommy Barnes fully embraced his role as a leader in the town's new direction. He became a regular volunteer at the community center, working with young people who, like him, had once been resistant to change. One afternoon, as Tommy sat on a bench outside the center, talking with a group of teenagers, he realized just how far he had come. The anger and fear that had once controlled him were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. "I used to think change was something to be afraid of," Tommy told the teens. "But now I see it's what makes us better. We can't grow if we don't open ourselves up to new ways of thinking." The teens listened intently, nodding in agreement. Tommy's journey had become an inspiration to many, showing that it was never too late to change. 1 year after the March for Unity, the town of Hollow Creek came together once again to celebrate. The town square was filled with music, food, and laughter, as people from all walks of life gathered to reflect on the progress they had made. James stood with Sheriff Nate Johnson, Emily Green, and Lily Sanders, watching the festivities with a deep sense of pride. The town was thriving, its people united by a shared vision of a better future. As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow over the square, James felt a quiet sense of contentment. Hollow Creek had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more united than ever. In the years that followed, Hollow Creek continued to evolve. The town's story became a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with their own divisions. People came from far and wide to visit Rose's Diner, to see the mural painted by the teenagers, and to meet the people who had made change possible. But for James, it wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about being a hero or a leader. It was about the quiet, steady work of building a community where everyone had a place. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the stars twinkle above the town, James felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, that there would always be more work to do. But for now, in this moment, he was content. Hollow Creek was his home, and it was a home worth fighting for. As the story of James and Hollow Creek shows, change takes courage, community, and a willingness to stand up for what's right. If you've been inspired by their journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the importance of unity, justice, and hope. And remember, your voice matters. Let us know in the comments how this story touched you and what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free. Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors' sons, strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith." "Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better now, richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.